Welcome to Houston House at South by Southwest. I'm Natalie Harms, editor of Innovation Map. In the months following George Floyd's death, businesses across the country are reevaluating how they approach diversity, equity, and inclusion within their organizations. And as employers spearhead these conversations and actions, employees are exploring a new way to talk about race in the workplace. I sat down with LaTanya Flix, Senior Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Greater Houston Partnership, to talk about navigating these challenging topics and what meaningful change to make organizations more inclusive and equitable looks like. LaTanya, thanks so much for joining me today. It's so good to meet you and to learn about what you do.
Likewise, great to be here and to meet you in person.
So tell me a little bit about your job at the Greater Houston Partnership. I know you're relatively new, so tell me a little bit about your background and what brought you to this position now.
Certainly. So my role is titled Senior Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I came to the position December 7th, so not even 90 days, so still extremely new. And prior to that, I led my own advisory practice, really focusing on racial equity, strategy, and community engagement. So that was my work. Before that, I was also nonprofit management and philanthropy and race equity. So this position really feels like the culmination of all of those efforts kind of wrapped into one. And so my work is both internal within the partnership, leading our internal learning journey and conversations about racial equity and looking at our own policies and practices, but also externally throughout the region and the broader community. And so I also serve as executive staff liaison to our Racial Equity Committee, which was established last fall. So pretty big role with multiple pieces and parts.
Yeah, absolutely. A very important role in this day and age. And is that why the Greater Houston Partnership kind of created this role and brought you in?
So these conversations began at the partnership last June. And so they began with community listening sessions. And then after that, there was the first regional DEI corporate survey. They also conducted a 5-part webinar series around issues of racial equity, community, health, what was racism. So a really, really deep dive. And after looking at all of that, really determined some priorities for the racial equity focus at the partnership. So it's a culmination of listening, of the moment we are in, and the partnership really prioritizing and saying, this is important and something we should be doing now. And so my role was created as a part of that process. And it's really the partnership signaling and saying very purposefully and intentionally that this matters to us and it matters to this region. And so the position was created as an executive level position and not inside of HR or in our talent department, but to really say this matters to us. And so we're going to commit resources to making sure that we can do this better.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, it's a very kind of buzzword, DEI. You hear it thrown around, but how do you really define it? And what is progress in this space?
Yeah, so diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. I think of diversity as composition, and that can be across any dimension of identity. So it might be race, gender, orientation, ableism, LGBTQ. There are many, many factors of identity. But anytime we have diversity in that composition, that's the D, right? So then E is for equity. And I define equity as the condition that exists when your identity, no matter which of those dimensions, no longer determines your outcome. Right? So it's the fair and just inclusion of people, and it's a condition that exists when identity is no longer a predictor of outcomes for you. And then the I is for inclusion, which is really about an experience. So think diversity, composition, I, inclusion, experience, E, equity, outcome. So 3 very different things, and you're right. People just say them, and sometimes I think we're talking about really different things, so I'm glad you asked and that I have a chance to define that.
Yeah. So when we talk about Houston, we talk about the D, of course. You know, Houston's been regarded as one of the most diverse cities in the nation, in the world even. So where are we at on the other E and the I as far as across the board within the city, but also within our corporations that reside here?
It's a really interesting question. The partnership initiated a baseline survey this past fall, and the questions weren't to the level that you're asking, the degree of diversity, but it was more about what are we doing now? And the question was really, do we have our head in the sand? Do we have awareness? And overwhelmingly, the companies that responded said, yes, we're aware, we're actively engaged. We have practices to recruit racially diverse candidates. We have internal policies. The survey also showed that 46% of the respondents don't have formal DEI policies. So at this point, that's the most that we know. And the next step of this learning journey and a part of this process will be to dig deeper. What does it mean as a region to prioritize this? Where are we starting? Where are we going? And where are the opportunities in that work? And so I would say right now we don't have all of that, but so many companies here in Houston have made this a priority and are doing it in different ways. And then we have people that are really at the beginning of the journey, right? And so if you think about it as a continuum, you might have inactive on the left and then best practice on the right. And we really have companies and institutions in the region that are at every point along that continuum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When we think about, corporations, it's like, put your money where your mouth is. What are these corporations, in terms of resources dedicating to DEI efforts? Is that changing? Is it growing? I hope it's not shrinking, but, how is that? What's your response to that?
So in early 2003, a professor at MIT did a study, and his research shows that corporations across the U.S. spend $8 billion, that's B, on diversity efforts a year. $8 billion. Over the since 2019, and then especially in 2020, you've seen an uptick in that. I haven't seen current numbers to say if we're tipping that 8 billion towards 10, but certainly there's more attention. There's more press. It's in the media, as you said. We're hearing it everywhere. Companies have made tons of public commitments. So there's certainly a will. Positions like mine are really popular right now. A lot of DEI or chief diversity officers or chief talent officers have been hired. So there's certainly will, there's certainly intent. You're seeing changes in practices and people making statements. So all of that is happening. So I would say we are on the active stage of activities. What remains to be seen is what the impact of those will be within companies and then within communities.
Yeah. So a lot of times, and you mentioned, DEI residing in the human resources, maybe traditionally, and because overall it does affect the company culture, right? Mm-hmm. So what is that effect of diversifying your workforce and the effect it has on company culture?
Yeah, people approach this in many ways. And so there are a couple of frames. One is around compliance. Like, we need to do this to comply with legal requests and mandates. The other one is more about altruism, saying that this is the right thing to do. It's a good thing, it's important. There's also the approach of shared humanity, that my humanity is tied with yours and we have a shared fate, so we should make this important. And then the other approach is really about the business case. And there's research, Natalie, if you will, on both sides of this. Some people say, and there is research to support it, that if you have diversity along any dimension, you have a better company. And the people that bring diversity to your company are non-homogeneous hires, right? So if everyone is the same within a company, you're losing something in your talent pool. So that's one frame. But we also know that just having diverse composition doesn't make a culture inclusive, and it also doesn't make it equitable. So really, diversity and composition is a floor and not a ceiling. And often in this work, it's become a ceiling. Like, we have difference here, ta-da. That's like the starting point. So once you have difference, then how do you create inclusive culture and belonging, which is really, really different than just having different bodies and different types of diversity. And so how do you create inclusive culture, and then how do you create equitable outcomes? So it's really a process, and it's long-term work. It's what I call journey work. You don't, check off the box, go to the diversity training, come back to your desk, and all is better. It's not simple in that way. So the process, there are many different approaches, and some people approach from business case, shared humanity, altruism, compliance, some combination of those. But it's work that's long-term, that requires deep commitment, and that you need resources for to make it effective. So there's not one way, right? People often come to this and they want to plug and play, right? They say, if we do the following, we will then be X. And it doesn't quite work that directly. So.
Yeah. I wonder how much of it is almost like an education process for companies that have been operating in one way, led by, very similar looking people for their entire existence, now needing to learn and how they do that.
So I always say that we can't train our way to justice or even train our way to equity. And again, it feels like in that compliance frame, that training became kind of the ceiling. Like we do training, we go back, and everything should be better. And what we know is whether it's unconscious bias training, diversity training, inclusivity training, whatever the training is, that you have to actually create bias disruptors and points of friction and processes that change behavior. So if we go to training and then we come back and we don't have a way to implement what we've learned, it doesn't really change culture. So if we're recruiting and we go to a bias training and we come back, the question becomes, how do I apply what I learned to my recruitment process? How do I apply what I learned to our performance evaluation process? How do I apply what I've learned to our language when we use words like professionalism and fit? How do we unpack those? So the success of this work often hinges on the way that we can disrupt our frequent and common and known behaviors, right? And that's kind of the secret sauce. And it's going to look different at every company. They're going to implement in different ways across industry, across sector, with the people within the organization. But it's how do we create points of friction that help us to change behavior?
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit kind of broadly on companies, but, and corporations, of course, have a different structure in place. But, when we think about small businesses, what are some resources and opportunities that these small businesses should take, even though they only have a staff of, let's say, 5-10 people, to make sure they are factoring in DEI initiatives, from day one of starting their company and into the growth years?
Yeah. So one, the Internet of Things does provide a lot for us in this area, and there are a tremendous number of even free curriculum that are online and available and that are quality. So that's one place that I always say to small businesses that you can start, is there. The other place is with conversation. To begin to have this conversation, often I'll ask people, what are the things that we're told not to discuss in polite society? And this is like in the context of a race equity conversation, and people will say politics, religion, money, and they'll look around like space travel, like what's the race, right? Like race is the other thing that we're told not to talk about. So whether it's a small company or a large company, there's just often a shyness, an apprehension, and aversion to talking about race. But that really is a starting point. So how do we in the small organization give voice to a concern, something that we could be doing better? So tons of resources on the internet that are good and available to begin to have conversation, and then to look at our operations as an enterprise and say, where can we apply this lens of inclusion and equity and really think about diversity? And don't start everything at once. Maybe it's not the entire company. Maybe you could think in a small company, you might not have the same, you won't have the same level of hiring that you have in a large corporation, but perhaps it's with supplier diversity and other contractors that you work with. Are you looking at that through an equity lens? How many of your contractors are all from the same type of identity group? Is that a possibility? When you do hire, where do you hire from? Do you get referrals only? Do you post in certain places? How do you build your pool of talent? So that's another place people can look. The products and services that they sell, are they designed for a large audience that is inclusive? Are you leaving money on the table by restricting what you sell, what you build, and what you offer to a certain population? So there are different spaces within a small business where people could look, but I would offer not to start everything at once, because then it becomes really overwhelming and you're just like, we can't do it, right?
Right. It's like comprehensive intentionality, like everything in the business line should go through that lens, sounds like.
And we use the word lens, and sometimes people will say embed or integrate, but throughout your operations, and you can start in one area first and then move on to the next. It doesn't all have to happen simultaneously, but finding resources, having conversations, getting training if needed, and deciding where can we prioritize first.
When you're working with companies, what do you observe as missed opportunities for them usually?
So one part is people are fearful that they may say the wrong thing. So sometimes the response to that is silence. And from the other side, that silence can be interpreted as people not caring or the company not caring. So silence is one area that doesn't help us to do this work well. The other part are assumptions that we all have the same lived experiences, and we don't. And then when people realize that, they don't know how to approach it. And so either being silent or making assumptions are kind of at the basis of a lot of that. And then sometimes it's fear-based, that people think that if we do something for one group, another group has to lose, right? And so we say that this shouldn't be either or thinking, but both and thinking, right? That we can do this and we can do that, and that no one has to lose. That equity, I consider it really the great invitation, that it's always inviting us to be in the question, to ask questions, and to think about the way we do things. So those are two things: silence, assumptions, the approach. I think not having an internal accountability mechanism. There's not one way to do this, as we talked about earlier, but one thing that we know works is having an internal either council, work group, advisory board. They call them many different things, but having an internal group that helps us to be accountable for the metrics that we set. Another thing that helps us to be successful is actually setting some metrics, right?
Yeah.
Measuring this. So if you start with hiring, what is the goal for hiring, right? And not just to say we want diverse candidates. Okay, what kind of diversity are we looking for? Is it in gender? Is it in race? Is it neurodiversity? What is the diversity that we're looking for? And define that. What is our baseline? So we know that assessment helps. As an organization, we should take a baseline assessment to see where we're beginning, so we can know if we're actually making progress. Because there's no other place within an enterprise or business where you would do work and not know your starting point. But somehow with DEI, it gets muddy, right? Like we throw money at it and we're just like, oh, look what happened, right? So starting a baseline, having an assessment, having an internal work group to help guide the work and be accountable for the work, having metrics, these are all good practices that help the work move forward. The other thing is having shared language. You know, we started by talking about what is DEI, what is race, what is anti-racism, what is bias. What do these terms mean when we use them within our organization? Because I could be talking about my experience in inclusion, and you may be talking about having diverse representation, and we think we're talking about the same thing. So having shared language is also really important. So those are some basic practices that help us to move it forward.
Yeah, you mentioned metrics and kind of taking that baseline. Are there other ways that companies can make sure they're doing the right thing to measure their success?
Tell me more when you say outside of metrics, or?
Well, I mean, I guess just how, as a collective, how are we making sure that, you know, maybe Houston as a whole is on this pathway to, success?
Great question. So now I'm tracking with you. So we've seen in other cities where they're actually creating regional indexes or benchmarks, and that's a suggestion we have right now on the table. And so we will know in the coming weeks whether we'll be able, let's say coming months, whether we'll be able to create a similar metric here in Houston, because that is the question when you think about regional competitiveness and other regions. And so companies that are looking to relocate, businesses that want to come into your region want to know, how are you doing on this? Does it matter, and are you making progress? So they're the individual benchmarks that companies might have. And the question is, can we roll these up and create some kind of regional index? And we've seen success with this in other metro areas. And I always say, if there's any city that can do this, it's Houston.
Yeah. So as soon as Houston was recognized as the most diverse city, I think that made it to the top of all of our kind of PR packets. Like, hey, we're diverse here. But, when it comes to Houston being a diverse city, what does that actually translate to for companies looking to move here? Like, what's the actual value add of being able to say, hey, we're a very diverse population?
Well, there's extreme value there to say that we're a diverse population. So that's one. I think the next question for companies is, what does that mean? And that's really the question of, can we be both the most diverse city and the most equitable city? Can we ensure that identity does not determine outcome for all Houstonians? And so I think that's the bigger question. It translates for companies that you have a diverse talent pool, right? You have a diverse consumer base. You have diversity of thought. You have diversity within sectors. You have people that come to Houston from all over the world. So diversity here means it's truly a global city, that's a tremendous value to a company. If culture matters to you, Houston is important because we're diverse in that way. If being around people that are different from you matters, you have that opportunity in Houston too. And so when companies come, their employees come with them. It's not just this kind of corporate monolith. And so they're looking for culture, they're looking for green space, they're looking for conversation, they're looking for great food. And Houston has all of that. So being a global city does matter. The question that's before us is, can we also become the most equitable city? And that's, I think, kind of the part two that companies want to know more about.
Yeah, I think it's just very, in 2021, whatever your company does, you are likely attracting a diverse customer base. So why not, I guess, have that parallel, that reflection in your company as well?
And people are really looking to, especially, so it comes from both the customer, but employees, and we especially see this with millennials that are looking for, not only do you have diverse customer base, but what is your CSR? What's your commitment to community, right? What's your impact? And so this notion of diversity and equity isn't just internal, but externally, how does the company live out that value? And so it matters for both customers and employees.
When companies are approaching the racism discussion and other isms, how does, the DEI perspective allow the door to open to more discussions on everything from racism to sexism to classism?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think of equity as the great invitation again. And so there's something called the curb cut effect, which was popularized by Angela Glover-Blackwell, I think around 2017. And a curb cut, Natalie, is when we're walking downtown and you get to the edge of a sidewalk. It used to be a huge cliff that you would have to step down. But now you can rollerblade, you can carry a stroller, a buggy, a cart, and there's that little... So that was created from disability activists who one night poured a concrete slab because they were tired of not being able to move around in their chairs. And so that's a great example how one thing that was meant and designed to benefit one population, one group, now benefits all of us. And I think of race equity in the very, very same way, that when we address race, we can also talk about class. We can also talk about gender. We can talk about ableism, heteroism. I call it the bucket of isms, right? All of the other things. And that talking about race doesn't diminish the other things. And it doesn't mean that we're taking from one to help another. But it's really, I call it very hope-filled work that invites us and provides an open invitation to have conversation. So the curb cut effect is really real there, and that it's not a zero-sum game. That equity really is this big invitation for us to do some big tent work, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. I will never look at a curb the same way. No.
It's in Berkeley. Read about the curb cut effect. If you just Google curb cut, one night disability activists, and you can imagine Berkeley with all those hills, right? Couldn't get around. They were like, we'll fix this.
Yeah.
And today, you and I benefit from that.
So it's such a fascinating topic and so enlightening to talk to you about all of your experience and what you're really seeing happen. So thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person, and hopefully we can have more conversations in the future. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thanks, Nat.